This is a new Mr. Men Little Miss book. Mr. Men and Little Miss at the hospital. Mr. Bump had learnt a lot of things in his life. To never step foot on a skateboard, to never climb ladders, and to never bounce on a trampoline. But yesterday morning he made a mistake and banged his head, and he had to go to hospital in an ambulance. And the ambulance driver was Little Miss Quick, so they got to the hospital right before you could say quick sticks. Super fast! Ambulances do go very fast, you know. Which was nearly as fast as the porter who rushed him into accident and emergency on the stretcher. The porter was Mr. Rush. Zoom! Hello, Mr. Bump, said Dr. Happy. Everyone at the hospital knew Mr. Bump. Being the accidental fellow he was there nearly every day. Who could blame him for having so many accidents? Dr. Happy checked him over, and then Nurse Naughty bandaged him up. Bandages on bandages! Isn't that silly? The next person to arrive at Mr. Hospital was Mr. Silly. Dr. Happy could not believe his eyes. He had never seen a case like Mr. Silly's. How on earth did that happen, he asked. But it was probably best not to ask. He's got a bin on his head and a trumpet on his foot. There were many reasons why people ended up at the hospital. Mr. Tall had hurt his leg and needed an X-ray to look at the bones. However, with Mr. Impossible as the doctor, he didn't have to go to the X-ray room because Dr. Impossible has Xray Vision. Ooh, clever. Bet you wish you had Xray Vision. If all doctors had Xray Vision, well, they could see into lots of things. Anyway, let's carry on with the story. Mr. Tall had broken his leg, and it needed to be set in plaster. An awful lot of plaster. And poor Mr. Tall had to walk with crutches. Extraordinarily long crutches. There were lots of different machines in the hospital. Mr. Nobody had to have a CAT scan, but the doctor could not believe his eyes when he looked at the screen. There was nothing inside Mr. Nobody, not a thing. That's impossible, cried Dr. Impossible. And he always knows about the impossible. Some people have impossibly difficult illnesses to diagnose, like little Miss Giggles, who was admitted with a rather peculiar problem. She kept making very odd noises. A tish hick giggle up too. A tish hick giggle up too. All the doctors came to see her, and they all went away scratching their heads. Whatever was wrong with little Miss Giggles? It took all Dr. Brady's brain power to work out that little Miss Giggles had a case of the hiccups with a fit of the giggles on top of the flu. Well, that's a really big disease, isn't it? Some people were at the hospital to have an operation. Before an operation, the operating room had to be germ-free, and the perfect person for that job was Little Miss Neat. It was the cleanest, shiniest, neatest operating room in the world. So clean, look. She could even see her face in it. I don't think Mr. Messy could get a job in a hospital, due to how messy he is. The patient was given an anaesthetic to put them to sleep before their operation. Unless the patient was Mr. Lazy, he was already fast asleep. The operation was then performed by a surgeon, who must have a very steady hand. I don't think Mr. Jelly would make a good surgeon, and definitely not Mr. Tickle. And while the patients were getting better, they stayed in a hospital ward where the nurses looked after them. Everything Nurse Perfect did was, of course, perfect. And you would think that Little Miss Helpful would also make a wonderful nurse, but as helpful as Nurse Helpful tried to be, things never quite went to plan. The head nurse on the ward was Little Miss Bossy, Matron Bossy. She didn't just manage the ward, she also made sure the patients behaved themselves. Especially patients like Little Miss Trouble. Sheesh. Nurse Hug worked in the maternity ward where babies were born. And she was very good at soothing all the babies. Look at those big long hugging arms of hers. She can hug 8 babies. Clever. While the patients were recuperating, they were allowed to have visitors, which was something to look forward to, unless the visitor was Little Miss Chatterbox. Chat, 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 chat. Little Miss Sunshine was very glad that the hospital had visiting hours, otherwise she might have been up all night. Mr. Greedy brought in some grapes for Mr. Quiet when he went to visit him, which was very thoughtful, except for the fact that Mr. Quiet didn't get to eat any. I wonder why. Yeah, Mr. Greedy ate them. Bad idea to ask Mr. Greedy to bring grapes, isn't it? When it was time to leave the hospital, some of the patients were wheeled to the exit in a wheelchair, like Mr. Quiet and Little Miss Sunshine when they were all better. However, they were wheeled out by Nurse Naughty and Mr. Mischief the Porter, who had a wheelchair race down the corridor. Matron Bossy was not happy. I don't blame her. As Little Miss Sunshine and Mr. Quiet were leaving, Little Miss Quick arrived in her ambulance with the sirens blaring. And who do you think she was bringing to the hospital? Somebody who had had an accident. And who could that be? I bet you can guess, can't you? That's right, Mr. Bump. Back again, said Dr. Happy. Well, here we go again for Mr. Bump. And look at all these did you know facts. Especially about Florence Nightingale, a famous nurse. And surgeons who deal with things like broken bones and orthopedic. Clever. So what do you think of this book? Next time you're in a hospital, think of this book, the Mr. Men and Little Misses, and you'll be all better before you're healed. See ya!